A leading educationalist is attacking the government for failing to act on boys' falling academic performance at school and beyond. Dr. Paul Baker claims the gap between girls and boys is widening and that the government response thus far has been timid and inept. He says the curriculum, teaching and assessment are all geared towards girls and that boys do markedly better in all boys' schools. He joins me now along with the Minister of Education, Steve Mahari. Good evening to you both.
Hi there, Susan.
Dr. Baker, I'll start with you. Let's pick you up on the big one. You say curriculum, teaching and assessment all geared towards the females. How?
Everything you do in the schools is not necessarily gender neutral. Every choice you make about what you're going to teach, how you're going to teach it and how you're going to assess it probably will end up favouring one gender over the other, because both genders are so different in their learning practices. During the 1990s there was a great move to make education more gender inclusive. I think that was the right thing to do. I think probably it's gone too far, and now boys are struggling, particularly in subjects that used to be the ones they were best at and keenest at, like technology and phys ed. And subjects like that, you see the largest gender gaps.
For girls, in favour of girls?
In favour of girls. And some technology achievement standards, the gender gap is up to 40 percentage points. That means girls might have a 60 to 70% pass rate, boys 20 to 30%. That's in technology. That tells me something's wrong with the way that subject has either been constructed or taught or assessed. That's the sort of thing the Ministry needs to be looking at.
Minister, let me bring you in here on your response to that.
Well, I guess the story I'd want to tell is this. We know that there are some problems for some boys. We know that, in general, those problems tend to be around reading, which is why we spend such a lot of time on trying to build their skills again. We know also that boys tend to drop out of school a lot faster than girls, so we spend time on what's called getting them engaged back in school again. We know Celia Lashley, for example, tells us that boys often have emotional issues that we ought to get on top of, because that also contributes to whether they learn or not. So no disagreement here that boys, some boys anyway, do have issues around their learning. We know that there is a gap between boys and girls. We don't think it is as big as the gap that Dr. Baker is pointing out, but we think there is a gap, and that's why we're spending so much time and money on it.
Let me talk to you about the evidence, because you yourself say the evidence is pretty thin. So what are you basing what you're saying on? Because you're talking about some pretty big gaps there.
The statistical evidence is not thin at all. The gap that is normally put forward to us is the gap based on the difference between male and female pass rates at each level of NCEA. That gap is between 10 and 12% and is fairly stable. But that gap does not give us the full picture, because it is only telling us about what's happening to students who are still at school. And as Dr. Mahari himself referred to, retention is also a problem for boys. By the end of year 12, 43% of boys have left school, only 35% of girls. So boys not only have a lower achievement rate, they also have a lower retention rate. The combination of those two things by year 13 causes a huge gender gap, much larger than the gap the Ministry is telling us about. If you look at all the students who gain a level 3 qualification, 41% of them are boys, 59% of them are girls. Now, I call that a massive gender gap, and the Ministry does not seem to be recognising that.
And Minister, if I can pick you up another statistic which I read today of Dr. Baker's, in 17 to 20-year-olds at university, only 42% are male. So that gap is continuing on, isn't it?
Yeah, we're starting to see girls come through in a way that they weren't traditionally coming into a whole range of subjects. So I'll go back to saying we're not disagreeing about the general issue, but we are disagreeing a little about the stats. Yes, there's about a 10% gap that comes through into the universities as well. We're seeing girls come into areas like maths now, and you're starting to see a gap between boys' performance and girls' performance there, but what we're comparing is a large group of boys who have traditionally done maths and a smaller group of girls who are coming in because they are good at maths and therefore they perform a whole lot better. So we've got to be really careful about the story that we tell, that we don't panic into saying all boys are failing. All boys are not. Most boys are doing pretty well.
I don't think Dr. Baker's saying that at all.
No, but that's the
boys in my
message.
school are certainly not failing.
Absolutely. Your school's a good school like all schools, and boys are coming through in large numbers and succeeding.
Let me pick you up there, and Dr. Baker may want to pick up on this. I don't believe all schools are good schools, and there's a real variance in what schools are doing, certainly for all students and for boys, reading what Dr. Baker has to say today.
But the essential point from all of that is that some boys are not doing well. So I'm glad you said what you said, Dr. Baker, because in a way, some of the stories we're running today is of boys are failing. Boys are not generally failing. Some are, and we need to address the core issues. And the root cause, as far as I can see, as the evidence would say, is reading. And we've got evidence coming out the next month or two that will be made available to Dr. Baker that shows, in fact, boys' performance has been picking up steadily now. So we're doing a whole lot better.
Let me talk to you about some research in Dr. Baker's today. It's about NCEA, and he surveyed co-ed principals, Minister, and I think this is fascinating. Two-thirds of these principals said NCEA favours girls. One-third said it was neutral. Nobody said it favoured boys.
I think the argument is, and we don't really have good evidence for this at the present time, that with internal assessment going on, people would say, well, girls are better at that, they tend to network, they do homework better, they do things that lend themselves to be able to cope with assessment. Now, if, just for example, say we accept that, then the challenge has got to be, how do we get boys those skills? Not to say, well, should they do a different kind of curriculum, which might be one of the implications for this. We want them to succeed in the 21st century, in a 21st century curriculum. So one of our challenges, if that is the case, is to ensure boys do adopt the kinds of skills they need to succeed.
So let's move on to that. Dr. Baker, what are you suggesting? I mean, what needs to happen for our boys? One of the numbers you came up with today, 9% of boys do better, so there's 9% improvement in all boys' schools. I mean, is that the answer? Should the boys be learning with boys?
I don't think we're going to see any more all-boys schools, but some co-ed schools have been running all-boys classes and with great reported success. And some researchers posit that as the best of both worlds. It's something particularly done at the junior level of classes, and especially in the subject of English, which is the one where boys will tend to learn the best in an all-male environment. I've surveyed the gender gap in all the co-ed schools in New Zealand, and the variety is absolutely huge. A lot of co-ed schools are doing extremely well for boys. Clearly in some co-ed schools there are problems with the learning culture of boys. That may reflect what's going on in the community also. I'm not blaming those schools. I think it's very hard for co-ed schools trying to cater for boys and girls' needs simultaneously, like walking on eggshells. It's much easier for boys' schools, which is why boys' schools statistically will do better for boys when you compare even co-ed schools of the same decile.
Today also, I mean, Dr. Baker's been fairly critical of your ministry. I think inept was one of the words, timid another of the words. So I'm assuming you're going to actually get time to read this report and have a sit down and talk to him, because it's a fascinating read.
Well, Dr. Baker's actually on a reference group, and I just want to reassure him that as the new Minister of Education, the reference group still exists. It's currently doing a literature review, and I'll be inviting him to come back and talk with me about his own research as well as the work the Ministry is doing in the relatively near future.
I'm pleased to hear that. That's the first thing I've heard since last October about the reference group, Minister.
Well, I've been the Minister since December.
Minister, one final question. You do accept that boys are different and learn differently, don't you?
I think boys generally do learn a little differently to girls, but I keep stressing, I'd hate any boy looking at this tonight to say this is a message about how boys fail. Some boys have adopted some behaviours that mean they're not doing as well as girls, and we're going to get that right.
All right. Steve Mahari, Paul Baker, thank you both for your time this evening. Still to come tonight, the family of our most famous war vet wants to sell the medals for millions. Does the government have any right to interfere?
Here Upham received his medal and ribbon.